Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Fellow Toastmasters and most welcome guests. Let's make sure the pointer's working. Oh, try now. Aha. Fellow Toastmasters, most welcome guests. I'd like you to picture Rochester. But a Rochester slightly different than the one we know. I'd like you to picture a Rochester where the old industry has been past its heyday. It's really started to rust away and leave behind remnants, and now new people, new ideas, new businesses are starting to take its place. I want you to picture a Rochester where the politics of the greater United States is inescapable. We just can't help but to talk about it, debate it, discuss it. We're all talking about these two big factions, and at one time they weren't all that different, but now it's just all we can seem to talk about. And I want you to envision a Rochester where a growing new technology is on the horizon. And artificial technology is starting to balloon, and it's dangerous. We don't know what it will do, but we're worried that it could impact those Rochester jobs. Who will be left after it makes its way to Rochester? Now, you may think that I'm describing Rochester today, or perhaps a Rochester in the future, but I am not. I'm describing for you a Rochester that already happened over 100 years ago. I'm describing Rochester in 1861. All of these problems that seem so familiar have already happened. Let's start with industry. As I mentioned, the big industry that we think of usually when we think of Rochester is Kodak. And now it's kind of gone. Well, there was something before Kodak, and that was flour. Rochester was known as the Flour City in 1861, but not a tulip or a rose flour. No, no. F-L-O-U-R, the process of moving grain, of wheat and turning it into grain. Flour was a huge industry in Rochester in the 1800s, in the early 1800s. But by 1861, it had started to fade away. Not because it wasn't profitable. Oh no, it was very profitable. However, those people that had made so much money in Rochester milling found out about westward expansion, about all these new states with low taxes, and all this land, 40 acres and a mule for a dime. Why wouldn't I take my money from Rochester and go west? And that's what many people did. There was a census in 1855 and 1860, and they found that of the 500 Rochester residents in 1855, 233 remained. 50% of those original Rochester residents had gone west. And yet, Rochester was growing. Rochester was still thriving. The population was going up. But how? Aha! But for the German and Irish immigrants that were flooding the streets of Rochester with new ideas, with old religions, but new ways and new culture. And that was quite the shock, and it completely is transformed. The Rochester we have today is culturally very based on those German and Irish that showed up. It wasn't so easy for them when they first showed up. There was a lot of hesitancy, especially with those Irish, those Murphys, those Flynn's, showing up in Rochester. Some hesitancy, but they made it through. Let's now move to politics. Does anybody know what might have been going on in the United States in 1861? Anyone? Call it out. Civil War. That was all anybody could talk about. This speech I'm giving is based on a book that I'm reading called Where They Fell by Robert Marcotte. And he follows the enlisted men in Rochester during the Civil War. And part of what he described was that the conversations around the Civil War in 1861 were all over Rochester. Everybody was very patriotic, and you could not escape the conversation of the southern states that had just seceded. Imagine, you go to the butcher shop, and you talk about the Civil War. You go to the library, and it's very quiet, but people are still murmuring about the Civil War. And then you go home after a long day of work. You talk about the Civil War, right? It's all anybody could talk about. And everybody was very enthusiastic. It was going to be a 5-month war. And many, many men of Rochester, young men, enlisted, formed regiments, were ready to go. In fact, they had a parade. They had a parade for the Rochester regiments. Now, this isn't an image of that parade because it was awfully different for those Rochester residents because they saw something very strange. The gentlemen marching from Main Street to the train depot had no uniforms. They had no guns or weapons of any kind, and they had no horses. Everybody was ready to go. No one was prepared. Now let's talk about that last big artificial technology that was booming, and it was on the horizon in Rochester at the time. This technology that we had been doing things manually for a while, but now we could move things quicker. Artificial locomotion was now a massive industry that people were starting to hop on board. They talk about my hometown, Brockport, New York. Brockport, New York was well known for the Erie Canal, which had only been dug maybe 40 years prior. Erie Canal in 1861 was old news. Erie Canal was slow. Trains were much, much faster. But again, many Rochester residents had to worry, where will my jobs go if I have horses, carts, if I owned a boat on the canal? Many of these people had to make very difficult decisions. So why do I bring this story to you today? Why do I tell you about 1861 in Rochester? I found that in reading Where They Fell, all of these problems that I thought were so unique to 2024, so unique to what we're feeling and experiencing today, had already happened. They were very familiar based on what people were facing in 1861. I think we get tunnel vision a little bit. It's kind of nice to see that Rochester's faced very difficult times in the past before. If you're interested in reading more, I highly encourage you to go to your library and pick up Where They Fell by Robert Marcotte. And they were actually giving out free copies originally. I don't know if they have any left, but you're welcome to try.